She was 29 years old when they handed her the wireless transmitter and a one-way ticket to Nazi-occupied France. The men in the briefing room at Special Operations Executive Headquarters had already written their concerns into her file. Too sensitive, too gentle, too mystical, not ruthless enough for the work. One training officer noted that she seemed more suited to writing children's stories than operating behind enemy lines. He had no idea that both things were true, and that the combination would make her one of the most remarkable intelligence operatives of the Second World War. Her name was Noor Inayat Khan, and on the night of June 16, 1943, she parachuted into the darkness over occupied France, carrying a radio that weighed 30 pounds and secrets that could save thousands of lives. Within 3 months, every other British radio operator in Paris would be dead or captured. She would be the last one left, transmitting hope into the void while the Gestapo closed in with radio detection vans and a network of informants. And when they finally caught her, after 4 months of relentless pursuit, she would spend her final year in chains, refusing to speak a single word that might betray her comrades. Until a September morning in 1944, when an SS officer put a bullet in the back of her head at Dachau concentration camp. Britain would eventually give her the George Cross, the highest civilian honor for valor, but by then she was already becoming a ghost in history. A woman too complex for simple narratives, too spiritual for spy stories, too uncomfortable for the myth-making that followed the war. This is the story of how an Indian Muslim princess who believed in absolute non-violence became one of the most courageous intelligence operatives the British ever deployed, and why, 80 years later, her story still haunts everyone who encounters it. To understand how impossible Noor's story is, you have to understand where she came from. She was born in Moscow on New Year's Day, 1914, the eldest daughter of Hazrat Inayat Khan, a Sufi master and musician who had left India to bring the mystical teachings of Islam to the West. Her mother, Aura Ray Baker, was an American woman who had become her father's disciple and then his wife. Noor, whose name means light in Arabic, was raised in a household where music was prayer, where compassion was the highest virtue, where violence was considered the ultimate spiritual failure. When she was 6 months old, her father moved the family to London, and then to Paris, settling in a house in Surin, just outside the city. This is where Noor grew up, in a home that was part Sufi lodge, part musical conservatory, part sanctuary for anyone seeking spiritual wisdom. Her father taught her that all religions were rivers flowing to the same ocean. He taught her that truth was more important than survival. He taught her that the purpose of life was to serve others with love and courage. And then, when Noor was 13, he died suddenly during a teaching tour in India, leaving her mother devastated and 4 children who needed support. Noor became, essentially, the parent. She cared for her mother, who never fully recovered from the loss. She helped raise her younger siblings, and she began writing children's stories, fairy tales, broadcasts for French radio. She studied child psychology at the Sorbonne. She played the harp and the veena, her father's instrument. She published a book of Indian children's tales. By her mid-20s, she seemed destined for a quiet life of art and scholarship, a gentle woman in a gentle profession, creating beauty in a world that desperately needed it. And then Hitler invaded France. The date was June 14, 1940. German troops marched into Paris while Noor and her family joined the chaotic exodus of refugees fleeing south. They eventually made it to England on one of the last ships out of Bordeaux. Noor was 26 years old, a refugee in a country at war, watching her adopted homeland collapse under Nazi occupation. And something in her made a decision that would have seemed incomprehensible to anyone who knew her. She was going to fight back. Now, here's what you need to understand about this decision. Noor was a committed pacifist. She had been raised in Sufi traditions that forbade violence. Her father had taught that harming another being was harming yourself, that all life was sacred, that the true jihad was the internal struggle against one's own darkness, not external combat. Her family assumed she would spend the war doing humanitarian work, maybe translating, certainly nothing involving weapons or combat. When she told them she was joining the Women's Auxiliary Air Force in November 1940, they were shocked. When they later learned she had volunteered for special operations for intelligence, worked behind enemy lines, they were devastated. But Noor had worked through her own spiritual logic. She wasn't abandoning pacifism. She was finding the one form of resistance that aligned with her principles. She wouldn't carry a gun, she wouldn't kill, but she could be a radio operator, a messenger, someone who transmitted intelligence that might shorten the war and save lives. She could be useful to the French resistance networks that were trying to liberate her beloved France from Nazi control. And most importantly, she could serve truth against the ultimate life fascism's claim that some human beings were worth less than others. She joined the WAAF and trained as a wireless operator. She learned Morse code, radio protocols, encryption systems. She was good at IT, patient, precise, attentive to detail. And somehow her application caught the attention of recruiters from Special Operations Executive, the British organization Winston Churchill had created with the directive to set Europe ablaze through sabotage, intelligence gathering, and support for resistance movements. So needed radio operators desperately. Wireless operators, or pianists as they were called, were the lifeline for agents in occupied territory. They transmitted intelligence back to London, received instructions, coordinated supply drops, and sabotage operations. It was also the most dangerous job in SO. The Gestapo and German military intelligence had sophisticated radio direction finding equipment. They could triangulate a transmission in minutes. The average life expectancy for a radio operator in occupied France was 6 weeks. When Noor was recruited in early 1943, she went through the standard SO training program at special facilities across England and Scotland, and this is where the doubts began. Her training reports are preserved in the archives, and they make for uncomfortable reading. Instructors noted that she was clumsy at fieldcraft, that she wasn't naturally deceptive, that she seemed too emotionally open and trusting for clandestine work. One report said she was too nervous and too temperamental for operations. Another stated she was not overburdened with brains and seemed unstable. The most damning assessment came from a commanding officer at the finishing school in Beaulieu, where agents learned the dark arts of living undercover. He recommended that she not be deployed. He wrote that she was fundamentally unsuited for the work, too honest, too sensitive, too bound by her own ethical code to become an effective liar. There's a particular poignancy in that observation, because what he identified as a fatal weakness, her inability to compromise her principles, would turn out to be the source of her extraordinary courage. But SO had a problem. They needed radio operators immediately. The networks in France were expanding, and there weren't enough trained wireless operators to support them. And Noor had one crucial qualification. She spoke perfect French. Having grown up in Paris, she knew the city intimately. She could blend in. So despite the concerns, despite the warnings, despite her training officer's recommendation that she be rejected, SO decided to deploy her. They gave her the code name Madeleine. They gave her a cover story as a children's nurse named Jean-Marie Renier. They gave her a wireless set disguised in a suitcase, a pistol she would never fire, and a cyanide pill in case she was captured and chose death over interrogation. And on the night of June 16, 1943, just before the full moon, a Lysander aircraft dropped her into occupied France near Le Mans. She was terrified. She later admitted that to her network organizer, but she went anyway, because she had decided that sometimes courage means doing what terrifies you, especially when the alternative is abandoning people who need you. What the training officers hadn't understood is that Noor wasn't weak. She was operating from a completely different framework of strength. They measured courage as ruthlessness, deception, the ability to kill without hesitation. She measured it as the willingness to suffer rather than betray, to risk everything rather than abandon her post, to maintain her humanity even in the machinery of war. Both were forms of courage, but only one would survive what was coming. Noor arrived in Paris and made contact with the Prosper Network, the largest SO circuit operating in occupied France. It was led by Francis Suttle, a British barrister operating under the codename Prosper, and it had grown to include dozens of agents, hundreds of resistance members, and multiple sub-networks across the Paris region. The organization was doing critical work sabotaging German installations, gathering intelligence on troop movements, preparing for the eventual Allied invasion. Noor's job was straightforward in theory, nearly impossible in practice. She needed to transmit intelligence back to London using Morse code on a radio transmitter that the Germans were actively hunting. Every transmission was a gamble. Turn on the radio and within minutes, German radio detection vans would start converging on your location. Transmit for too long, and they'd pinpoint your exact address. The protocol was brutal. Keep messages short, never transmit from the same location twice, move constantly, trust no one completely. She set up her first transmission post in a safe house in the 16th arrondissement, and she began sending intelligence about German defenses, information about troop deployments, requests for supply drops for the first few weeks. It worked. She was nervous but competent. She filed her reports, received her instructions, moved her equipment to different locations around Paris. She was one of multiple radio operators supporting the network, so the pressure was distributed, and then everything collapsed. In late June and early July 1943, disaster struck the Prosper Network. The exact details remain disputed by historians, but the outcome was catastrophic. Francis Suttle was arrested, then his second-in-command, then dozens of agents across the network. Some were betrayed by informants, some were caught through radio surveillance, some walked into Gestapo traps, baited with turned agents. Within 2 weeks, the entire leadership structure was destroyed. Over 100 members of the network were arrested. Many would die in concentration camps. And suddenly Noor was the only radio operator left in Paris. Let me emphasize that. She was the only functioning wireless link between London and what remained of the French resistance in the Paris region. Every other SO radio operator had been captured or had escaped. She was alone, in the most dangerous city in occupied Europe, with a piece of equipment that marked her for death and a network that had just been decimated by the Gestapo. So headquarters in London knew the situation was desperate. They sent her an urgent message recalling her to England. They had a Lysander ready. She could be extracted within 72 hours. All she had to do was acknowledge the order and head to the pickup point. She refused. She transmitted back that she wanted to stay. She said that the resistance members who remained needed her, that there were still networks operating, still intelligence to gather, still hope to transmit. that if she left, the work would die completely. She acknowledged the danger, and she chose to stay anyway. This is the moment that defines her, not the parachute jump, not the training, but this quiet refusal to abandon her post when she had every legitimate reason to leave. British intelligence officers in London couldn't understand it. Some thought she was being reckless, that her judgment was impaired by stress. But Noor had made a calculated decision rooted in her deepest values. She had promised to serve. People were depending on her. Running away because the situation had become dangerous would be, in her understanding, a betrayal of everything she believed, so she stayed. And she started transmitting from new locations around Paris, trying to rebuild the shattered networks, maintaining the link between London and the French resistance. She moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice if she could avoid it. She carried her radio in a suitcase, wearing out her shoes, walking across Paris to find safe transmission sites. She became hypervigilant, watching for surveillance, memorizing the faces of people who appeared too often in the same neighborhoods. And she was good at the work. Her transmissions were clear, her security protocols tight. She established contact with surviving resistance groups. She coordinated supply drops. She passed intelligence about German military movements. For 4 months, she kept the communication channels open. For months, when, by all reasonable expectations, she should have been captured in 4 weeks, but the strain was extraordinary. She was operating in a constant state of fear, knowing that every transmission might be the one that brought the Gestapo to her door. She had no backup, no support network she could fully trust after the betrayals that had destroyed Prosper. She was living on adrenaline and determination, sleeping a few hours at a time, always ready to run. There's a moment that captures the surreal horror of her situation. She was transmitting from an apartment one afternoon when she heard boots on the stairs. German soldiers, coming up toward her floor. She frantically shut down the radio, shoved it under furniture, and answered the door with a smile, pretending to be a harmless Frenchwoman. The soldiers were conducting a search for black market goods. They looked around the apartment, asked a few questions, and left. She waited until their footsteps faded, then collapsed, shaking, but she transmitted again that evening from a different location, because that's what the work required. What sustained her through this impossible period was the same spiritual foundation that had made British intelligence doubt her. She meditated every day, practicing the Sufi techniques her father had taught her. She found moments of beauty in the occupied city flowers in a window box, a child's laughter, sunlight on the Seine. She wrote letters to her family that she couldn't send, maintaining her connection to who she was beneath the cover identity. She reminded herself that fear was natural but didn't have to control her choices, and she kept transmitting intelligence reports, coordination messages, pleas for more supplies for the resistance. Each message was an act of defiance against the Nazi occupation, an insistence that truth and hope still existed even in the darkest circumstances. But the Gestapo was patient, and they were very good at their work. They had captured several SOE radio operators and tortured them for their security checks and protocols. They had turned some agents, forcing them to transmit under German control. They had infiltrated resistance networks with informants, and they knew someone was still broadcasting from Paris, someone skilled and careful who kept evading their detection vans. They assigned their best people to hunt her, counterintelligence specialists who studied her transmission patterns, mapped her possible locations, built a profile of her movements. They increased patrols in neighborhoods where her signals had been detected. They put pressure on resistance members they'd captured, demanding information about the radio operator called Madeleine. And they set traps. One afternoon in October, Noor was approached by someone who claimed to be a resistance member who needed to make contact with London. She agreed to meet at a safe house to discuss arrangements. What she didn't know was that the resistance member had been arrested weeks earlier and was now working for the Gestapo. The meeting was a trap. On October 13, 1943, she arrived at the apartment in the Rue de la Fazanderie. Gestapo agents were waiting. They arrested her immediately. She tried to escape, actually managed to get out onto the roof of the building, but they caught her and dragged her back inside. They had her wireless set, her codes, her papers. They had captured the woman British intelligence had considered too gentle for the work, who had somehow survived for months as the last radio operator in Paris. But what they didn't have, and would never get, was her cooperation. The Gestapo took Noor to their headquarters at 84 Avenue Foch, an elegant Parisian building they'd converted into an interrogation center. This was where they brought captured SO agents, where the feared interrogator Joseph Kiefer ran his operations, where sophisticated psychological torture was combined with physical brutality to break prisoners and extract intelligence. They expected Noor to break relatively quickly. She was a woman. She had no training in resisting interrogation beyond the basic SOE protocols. She was emotionally sensitive. Their captured agents had told them that she would talk. They just needed to apply the right pressure. They had no idea who they were dealing with. From the moment of her capture, Noor refused to cooperate in any way. She gave them nothing beyond her cover name. She wouldn't reveal the identities of other agents. She wouldn't discuss resistance networks. She wouldn't explain her codes or security protocols. When they offered her deals, cooperate and you'll be treated well. We already know everything anyway. Just confirm what we suspect." She remained silent, and she tried to escape twice. The first attempt came within days of her arrival at Avenue Foch. She was being held with two other captured SO agents, Leon Fay and John Renshaw Starr. Together, they worked loose a section of the roof tiles above their holding cell and tried to crawl across the rooftops. They were caught before they made it off the building, but the attempt was remarkable. She had been in Gestapo custody for less than a week and was already trying to break out. The second escape attempt was even more daring. In November, she and the same two agents managed to get onto the roof again during an air raid when the guards were distracted. This time they made it farther, crawling across multiple buildings before they were discovered and dragged back. The Gestapo was furious. They'd never had a prisoner, let alone a woman, attempt to escape twice. But more than her escape attempts, what frustrated the Germans was her absolute refusal to provide any intelligence value whatsoever. They had her codes, her radio, her papers, but without her cooperation, they couldn't run an effective radio game to deceive London or capture other agents. She had sabotaged everything she could before her capture, scratching out key information in her notebooks, destroying what documents she could. The Gestapo interrogators tried everything. They threatened her with execution. They described in detail what would happen to her family if she didn't cooperate. They used sleep deprivation, isolation, psychological manipulation. They showed her files suggesting other agents had already betrayed the networks, so her silence was pointless. She saw through every manipulation. She had no training in advanced resistance techniques. She simply had the fundamental conviction that betraying her comrades would destroy her soul more completely than anything the Gestapo could do to her body. One of the German officers who dealt with her later said she was the most difficult prisoner they ever encountered, not because she was aggressive or hostile, but because she had found some internal place of strength that their techniques couldn't reach. She remained polite, even gentle in her manner, but absolutely immovable. After her second escape attempt, the Gestapo made a decision. Noor was too dangerous to keep in Paris. She needed to be sent to Germany, to a facility where she could unescape and where the full apparatus of Nazi imprisonment could be applied. In late November 1943, she was transferred to Pforzheim prison in southwestern Germany, and here the conditions became truly brutal. She was classified as a dangerous prisoner and placed in chains, not handcuffs, actual chains, fastened around her wrists and ankles, connecting her to the wall of her cell. She would remain in these chains for 10 months. Her cell was tiny, solitary, dark. She was forbidden to speak to other prisoners. Her food was minimal. She had no books, no writing materials, no contact with the outside world. The prison director, a Nazi official named Wilhelm Krauss, later testified that he was ordered to keep her in chains at all times because she was considered a security risk. The chains were supposed to break her, to make her so desperate that she would agree to cooperate if they removed them. She never cooperated. Think about this for a moment. 10 months in chains, in solitary confinement, in a Nazi prison. No sunlight, no human contact beyond hostile guards. No idea if the war would ever end, if her family knew she was alive. If her sacrifice meant anything, she could have bought better treatment by revealing intelligence that, by this point, was probably outdated anyway. She could have given them names of people who were likely already captured or dead. She could have made one small compromise to ease her suffering. She refused, because she had decided, somewhere in the depths of her Sufi faith and her personal code of honor, that some things were more important than survival, that betraying trust was worse than dying, that maintaining her integrity in the face of evil was the only victory that actually mattered. The guards reported that she remained remarkably composed. She meditated in her chains. She maintained her prayer practices as best she could. When she was allowed to exercise still in chains, she moved with dignity. She didn't curse her captors or rage against her fate. She simply endured, day after day, holding on to whatever internal light kept her human. Other prisoners reported hearing her voice, singing quietly when she thought the guards couldn't hear. Songs from her childhood, Sufi melodies her father had taught her. Music was her prayer, even in chains. But the Nazis had no intention of keeping her alive indefinitely. By September 1944, the Allied forces were advancing across France. The Reich was contracting, prison populations were becoming liabilities, and the SS was beginning the final phase of eliminating witnesses to their war crimes. On September 11, 1944, Noor was transferred one final time, along with 3 other female SO agents Yolanda Beekman, Eliane Pluman, and Madeleine Damament. She was taken by train to Dachau concentration camp near Munich. They arrived late at night. The camp was a factory of death by this point in the war, processing thousands of prisoners through its gas chambers and crematoria. The 4 women were kept separate from the general prison population. They knew what was coming. They had perhaps hours left to live. Early the next morning, September 12, 1944, the 4 women were taken to the courtyard by the crematorium. They were made to kneel. An SS officer named Friedrich Wilhelm Rupert positioned himself behind them. According to witness testimony from prisoners who worked at the crematorium, Noor was the last of the 4 to be executed. She was forced to watch as her 3 companions were shot. One by one, she knew she was next. She had perhaps 30 seconds left to live. And in those 30 seconds, she spoke her last word, Liberté, freedom. Then Rupert shot her in the back of the head. She was 30 years old. She had endured 10 months of torture and imprisonment without breaking. She had maintained her dignity, her principles, her soul, and her last act on earth was to speak the word that had defined her entire mission: freedom for France, freedom for humanity, freedom of the spirit that no prison or chain or bullet could ultimately destroy. Her body was cremated immediately. There was no grave, no memorial, no marker. The Nazis had tried to erase her completely, to make her suffering and courage disappear into the machinery of their death camps. They failed. For years after the war, Noor's family had no idea what had happened to her. British intelligence knew she had been captured, but the details of her imprisonment and death emerged slowly as archives were opened and witnesses interviewed. Her mother, who had never fully recovered from the loss of her husband, learned her eldest daughter had died in Dachau. Her brother, Williat, spent years investigating the circumstances of her death, tracking down German officers who had been involved, piecing together the final months of her life. The British government eventually recognized her extraordinary courage. In 1949, she was posthumously awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian decoration for valor. The citation read, "She displayed the most conspicuous courage, both moral and physical, over a period of more than 12 months. In 1946, France awarded her the Croix de Guerre, their military honor for valor. But public recognition came slowly and incompletely. The official SOE histories barely mentioned her. When books about wartime espionage were written in the decades after the war, she appeared in footnotes, if at all. There was something about her story that didn't fit the dominant narratives. She was Muslim in a story about Christian Europe's struggle against fascism. She was Indian in a British intelligence service. She was a woman in accounts dominated by male agents. She was spiritual and pacifist in stories that celebrated ruthless efficiency. And perhaps most problematically, she had succeeded precisely because of qualities the intelligence establishment considered weaknesses. She hadn't been a natural deceiver or a trained killer. She had been a gentle, principled woman who refused to compromise her values, and that had made her unbreakable. It was an uncomfortable lesson for intelligence agencies built on deception and moral relativism. In 1952, a bust of Noor was unveiled in Gordon Square Gardens in London, near the house where she had lived with her family. It was the first memorial to a Muslim woman in Britain. The inscription reads, "Noor Inayat Khan, George Cross, member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, Croix de Guerre with Gold Star, descendant of Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Moscow, gave her life for the freedom of France in World War II." In France, memorials came more slowly. A street in Suresnes, where she grew up, was named after her. A plaque was placed on the building where she transmitted her first messages. But she remained relatively unknown to the French public, overshadowed by male resistance heroes. In India, the country of her father's birth, she was virtually forgotten. Here was an Indian woman who had received Britain's highest honor for civilian valor, who had fought against fascism, who embodied the ideals of courage and self-sacrifice that new nations celebrate. But she was Muslim, she was a woman, and her story was complicated by her service to the British Empire during the independence struggle. She didn't fit easily into nationalist narratives. But over the past few decades, something has begun to shift. Historians have returned to her story with fresh eyes. Biographers have investigated the archives and interviewed surviving witnesses. And a new generation has discovered a hero who speaks to contemporary concerns in ways that wartime heroes often do. Because Noor's story isn't about nationalism or military might or conventional heroism. It's about moral courage in its purest form. It's about a woman who was told she was too gentle, too sensitive, too spiritual for important work, and who proved that those qualities were sources of extraordinary strength. It's about someone who found a way to fight fascism without abandoning her pacifist principles, who chose resistance over safety, who maintained her humanity in the machinery of war. Her story is especially powerful for young women, particularly Muslim women, who see in her a reflection of their own struggles to be taken seriously in male-dominated spaces, to honor their faith while engaging with the secular world, to be gentle without being considered weak. Noor demonstrated that you don't have to become hard to be strong, that compassion and courage aren't opposites but complements. There's a particular poignancy in her relationship to India and Pakistan. She was born to an Indian Muslim father and lived to see the partition debates that would eventually split the subcontinent along religious lines. She would have witnessed the violence and the displacement that accompanied independence. But her own life suggested a different possibility: a cosmopolitan, mystical Islam that transcended nationalism, that found common ground with all faiths, that measured worth by character rather than identity. If she had survived the war, she would have been 50 at the time of Indian independence. One wonders what role she might have played in those early years, whether her voice might have offered an alternative to the sectarian divisions that scarred the region. But that's speculation. What we know is that she gave her life for freedom before she could see her father's homeland become free. In recent years, her story has appeared in documentaries, biographies, even a Bollywood film. A blue plaque marks the house in London where she lived. Princess Anne unveiled a bronze statue of her in Bloomsbury in 2021, showing Noor in her WWII uniform, standing with quiet dignity. The memorial sparked fresh conversations about her legacy, about Britain's Muslim community, about the contributions of women and minorities to the war effort that have been erased from popular memory. But perhaps the most fitting memorial is the simplest. In the Imperial War Museum in London, there's an exhibition about SO operations in France. Among the photographs of agents and the fragments of equipment, there's a small display about Noor. It includes one of her notebooks, salvaged from Avenue Foch after the liberation of Paris. The pages show her neat handwriting, codes and messages and schedules, and on one page, almost hidden, is a small drawing she made during her brief time in Paris, a simple sketch of a bird in flight. That image captures something essential about her. She was the woman who could have flown to safety but chose to stay, who was caged and chained but never broken, who sang in the darkness and spoke of freedom with her last breath. Noor's story forces us to reconsider what we mean by strength and courage. The intelligence officers who doubted her were using one framework: ruthlessness, deception, emotional detachment. She was operating in a completely different framework: integrity, compassion, spiritual discipline. Both required courage, but her form of courage proved more sustainable under the ultimate pressure. When she was captured, agents trained in ruthless efficiency broke and cooperated. She, who had been considered too gentle, never broke. When she was chained and isolated, her spiritual practices sustained her. The same sensitivity that made her training officers doubt her allowed her to maintain her humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. There's a lesson here about how organizations evaluate talent. The British intelligence establishment almost rejected her because she didn't conform to their model of what a spy should be. They nearly lost one of their most effective and courageous operatives because they confused gentleness with weakness, spiritual discipline with instability, compassion with How many other Noors have been rejected by institutions that could unrecognize forms of strength that do look like traditional power? How many gentle, principled people have been told they're not tough enough for important work, when in fact their gentleness is exactly what the work requires? Noor also challenges us to think about sacrifice and purpose. She could have stayed in England, done important but safe work, survived the war and lived a long life writing and teaching. She chose instead to volunteer for the most dangerous work imaginable, not because she loved violence or adventure, but because she believed deeply in freedom and couldn't stand aside while people suffered. She made that choice knowing she might die, knowing she probably would die, and she made it anyway, because some things were more important than personal survival. That's an uncomfortable truth in an age that prioritizes safety and self-care above all else. Sometimes courage means accepting risk. Sometimes love means sacrifice. But she didn't sacrifice herself cheaply or meaninglessly. She wasn't seeking martyrdom, she was seeking usefulness. She believed she could help, that her skills and courage could make a difference, that one person transmitting hope into occupied France mattered, and she was right. The intelligence she transmitted saved lives. The networks she supported contributed to the liberation of France. Her refusal to cooperate prevented the Gestapo from capturing additional agents. Her 4 months as the last radio operator in Paris represented hundreds of transmissions, countless resistance actions coordinated, intelligence that helped the Allied war effort, and her 10 months of imprisonment, refusing to break, protected people whose names she never revealed. Every day she endured was a day someone else remained free. That's not meaningless suffering. That's courage and service of something larger than oneself. And finally, Noor reminds us that heroism is often found in unexpected people. The princess who became a spy, the pacifist who went to war, the children's author who fought the Gestapo, the woman dismissed as too gentle who proved unbreakable. History is full of these surprises, these people who don't fit the expected categories but who rise to extraordinary challenges through unexpected strengths. She would have been uncomfortable with the word hero. Her Sufi faith taught humility, taught that the ego was something to transcend, not celebrate. She saw herself as a servant, fulfilling a duty, doing what needed to be done. But that's precisely what makes her heroic: the lack of self-regard, the focus on service rather than glory, the willingness to do the hardest work in the quietest way. 80 years after her death, Noor Inayat Khan remains a challenge and an inspiration. A challenge to our assumptions about strength and weakness, courage and fear, gentleness and power. An inspiration for anyone who has been told they're too sensitive, too spiritual, too different to do important work. She proved that the qualities that make us different are often the ones that make us extraordinary. Her last word was Liberté, freedom. It was the purpose of her mission and the condition of her soul. She fought for France's freedom from Nazi occupation. She fought for humanity's freedom from fascist ideology. And in her final moments, chained and kneeling, about to die, she achieved the ultimate freedom, the freedom that comes from knowing you lived and died with integrity. Continue 1831, that no power on earth could force you to betray yourself. That's the kind of freedom that transcends chains and camps and bullets. That's the kind of light that survives in memory long after darkness falls. Noor means light. She brought it into occupied France during the darkest years of the war. She carried it through Gestapo interrogations and Nazi prisons. And she left it behind in her story, illuminating a path for anyone who wonders whether gentleness can be powerful, whether principles matter more than survival, whether one person's courage can make a difference. The answer, demonstrated in her life and death, is yes.